Okay, yes, so very generous introduction. Thank you, Ola. I wouldn't say I was an expert at transdisciplinary research. I've been working in that space for quite some time, but it's very difficult to become an expert in anything as complex as that. So I'm happy to share what I've learned, but I'd be reluctant to use that label for myself. So welcome everybody to this talk on what I'm calling connected leadership for transdisciplinary research. And I'm assuming this is a mostly academic audience. I'll be referring to some research in this presentation, and there'll be links to the studies at the end, so you don't need to frantically take screenshots or copy down the details. I'll try and make them available. But I'd like to start with the context of leadership here, and that is about transdisciplinary research. I believe that the essence of transdisciplinary research is collaboration. As Ola mentioned, I had the privilege of moderating the QUT eGrad module on transdisciplinarity in research this year, and the readings for this module and from the literature in general highlight that there really is no single definition of transdisciplinary research that everybody agrees with. But there are some common features that differentiate it from other forms of research like interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary or even traditional disciplinary research. And these features really are the team typically includes people outside academia as well as people from multiple academic disciplines. Typically, it's focused on a complex real-world challenge, and the methodologies that are used are typically bespoke. They really are just created for that particular challenge that people are working on. So you basically, if you're doing transdisciplinary research, then you end up with a very diverse group of stakeholders, including researchers and non-researchers. You are focused on addressing that complex real-world challenge, and you're using a bespoke methodology. And all of this is really only possible if you have a really high degree of collaboration. Like, it's just not going to work if everyone sticks to their own thing. You really need everyone coming together and collaborating in a very deep and meaningful and rich way in order for transdisciplinary research to actually take place. So what does it actually take to do that, to foster this highly collaborative research with all these diverse stakeholders? In my abstract, I mentioned you really just need to create a culture of inclusivity and accessibility and respect that will nurture the trust and the understanding that's required for this deep and meaningful collaboration. So that's it. Quite easy, really. Well, in some cases, maybe not. But one thing that can help and certainly make it more possible is having the right kind of leadership in place. And that's what I'll be talking about today. Like, what does the leadership look like that really makes all of this possible? But unfortunately, the dominant leadership paradigm that we face today, the way most people understand leadership, it's kind of counterproductive to promoting the kinds of trusted relationships that you need for transdisciplinary research. And what I'm talking about here is this narrative of what they call the heroic leader. Leaders who have single-handedly changed the world for better or for worse because of their innate leadership qualities. And these stories can be very powerful and inspiring and even seductive, but they rarely tell the whole story. I mean, after all, Steve Jobs didn't build the iPhone on his own, and Elon Musk, he didn't build the Teslas or the rockets by himself. All of the innovations that took place that changed society in different ways, they took thousands of people and billions of dollars over many, many years to make happen. It's not the story of a single person. But that hasn't stopped researchers from searching for the traits and the qualities of these great leaders. What we've found is the results are actually very weak at best. And so I kind of call this is what we refer to as the old science and the old paradigm of leadership. But unfortunately, this old paradigm of leadership is very profitable. And just a question to get people thinking, how much do you think the leadership development industry is worth every year? Like, what do you think is roughly spent on leadership development globally every single year? And I just realized that I haven't kept up with my slides. So there we go, collaboration. Well, the answer, that's heroic leadership. The answer is here. It's about $60 billion every single year is spent on leadership development. And that's quite a lot of money. But despite all that investment, it's fascinating to me that it's very difficult to find a return on investment that's reliably more than zero. And that, to me, is an incredible waste of money. It'd be hard-pressed to find somewhere else where so much money is spent with so little to show for it. Every time I say that, someone challenges me and says, oh, well, in this particular case, it also happens. So I won't go there today. But yeah, generally speaking, with leadership development, people are not getting value for their money that's spent on that. Now, most of us will have experienced the lack of good leadership firsthand. And if we do find a good leader, then we typically try and stay with them because they're so rare. So why is good leadership so elusive? Well, to answer that question, first, very quickly, just want to explain what leadership is not, because that'll help everyone understand then better what it is. So to begin with, leadership is not about the leaders. It's not about their qualities and their attributes and so on. Again, that belongs to the old science and the old paradigm of leadership. And it's not even about the followers. Some people say that, oh, it's very true that you can't have leadership without followers, so let's focus on the followers, but that's not quite right either. One thing's definitely for sure is leadership is not about making people do things against their will. It's standing up and command and control model where it's like, everyone has to do what I say as the leader who is the source of all truth and authority. And that's because it's incredibly difficult and it's not sustainable, nor will it encourage creative and innovative thinking on solutions, or will it create the psychologically safe spaces that are needed for people to flourish. Okay, so what is leadership about then, and how can we all be better leaders? And to me, the essence of good leadership is captured in the following quote. And that is that leadership is not simply about getting people to do things, it's about getting them to want to do things. And following from that, we have the quote here that leadership concerns the shaping of beliefs, desires, and priorities. It involves sharing a vision of how the world was, is, and should be. Ultimately, it's about achieving influence, not securing compliance. And that leads to the following definition of leadership, where it's the process through which one or more people influence other members of the group in a way that motivates them to contribute to the achievement of the group goals. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, this is not a controversial definition. This is quite straightforward. There isn't much that people would disagree with that. It seems pretty straightforward in that way. But there are a couple of elements of this that are definitely worth highlighting that maybe aren't so initially obvious. First is leadership is fundamentally, it's a group process. It's about us or we. It's not about I or me. It's not about the leader. And nor is it about the followers. Instead, it's about the relationships between the leaders and the followers. How do the leaders and the followers interact, and how do they behave towards each other? That's ultimately what makes it about us or we. And because leadership is about these relationships, it's highly contextual. Just because you are a good leader with one group of people, that doesn't mean you will be with any other group. I've met many leaders who believe that because they think they did a good job leading in one context with one group of people, then that automatically makes them a brilliant leader in every other context with all other people. And if things don't work out, it's because the followers or the underlings weren't doing their job. Oh, I'm sorry, but that's complete and utter garbage. If the group is dysfunctional and things aren't working out, it's pretty much always a direct consequence of the so-called leaders and the leadership practices. And this also means that leadership can be hard work because you really kind of need to start from scratch each time and build those trusted relationships and create that culture of inclusivity and respect. But this is what we mean by the new science of leadership, and something I like to call connected leadership. Now, connected leadership, in particular, it weaves together the best of Western and Indigenous science and wisdom to nurture a more inclusive, collaborative, productive, and healthy culture. Due to time constraints, I'm really going to have to focus very much on the Western science in the rest of this talk. I will talk a little bit about the Indigenous side of things, and I'm also more happy to talk about that in the Q&A if that's of interest to people. Now, the Western science behind connected leadership is based on the application of social identity theory to leadership. For those who aren't familiar with it, I certainly wasn't until a few years ago. Social identity theory is a psychological theory in which an individual's sense of who they are is based on their group memberships, and group affiliations provide a sense of belonging and purpose. In particular, I'll be drawing on the research that led to the development of the 5R leadership program by the Social Identity and Groups Network at the University of Queensland, in which leadership is understood as a process of social identity management. Now, the research has also been summarized in a textbook, which you can see on the screen. It's called The New Psychology of Leadership, Identity, Influence, and Power by Alex Haslam, Stephen Riker, and Michael Plateau. And when I refer to the authors during this talk, so talk about some of the research, I'm really referring to the authors of this textbook. And it really is an incredible, for me, it's been an incredible eye-opener as to what's possible in this space. So I'll now explain what all of this means for being a more effective leader for transdisciplinary research projects in 4 parts. Now, the first part is that if you're going to be a leader, you've got to be an effective leader, then you really need to be one of us. What I mean by that is that you need to model the ideal behaviors of one of the team of the organization, and that the leaders can't be separate from the team. They can't be like barking orders down from above, making command and control decisions, or only appearing once every week or two to make a few remarks and then to disappear again. They really need to be a part of the team and understood to be really having the ideal behaviors of one of that team. And there is an absolute incredible evidence base supporting this claim. So firstly, what we have here is a meta-study of 128 different independent samples with many, many, many data points, as you can see. And what it shows very, very clearly with all the data points that are to the right of the red lines there, that the more a leader is seen to be an ideal member of the team, and not someone special, not someone separate from it, but an ideal member of that team, then the more effective they were in a whole range of different leadership outcomes. So in other words, they were better leaders. That's a really fascinating study. And I also quite like this one. In this particular case here, what we can see is this is looking at the general population and their preference for prime ministers who talk about us or we instead of I or me in their talks and speeches on the election campaign. And what I find fascinating here is that the general population have voted. Like 80% of the winners use more of the group pronouns over the individual. So people are naturally drawn to people who talk about us or we compared to just I or me. The second point is that if you're going to be an effective leader of these transdisciplinary research projects for sustainability, then effective leaders, you can't just be one of us. You've got to go beyond that and actually do things for us. You need to take action. It's very much about what you do as a leader, not just, okay, yeah, I can see that this leader is one of us. They've actually got to do stuff. They've got to take action. And those actions must advance the interests of the group, not their own. And what I mean here is specifically, their actions must advance the interests of the group in the terms specified by the group's own norms and values, which means that the leaders really need to have a very clear understanding of the social identity of the group or a team that they're a part of. So you've really got to be part of the group and understand what that group values so that you can take actions that the group are going to recognize as, yeah, they're really advancing and acting on our behalf. So this is an easy thing to do. It's not. But if you do it well, the research has shown that the group will then see you as being very charismatic and influential. And you'll also be much better at enlisting the efforts of all of the followers to help realize that shared vision. There was a remarkable study that showed that the number of suggestions and ideas that people had to help make the vision a reality, it's like an order of magnitude more when people feel like, okay, yeah, this leader is doing it, is part of us and is doing it for us. They're going to be so much more willing and able to make that happen. So an incredibly important point. The third point is that leaders, effective leaders, help craft a sense of us. So what I mean by this is that the leaders don't just accept what everybody says. It's like, oh, well, this is a social identity based on what everyone's saying, but they can be thought of as masters of the identity. They're actively involved in shaping the shared understanding of who we are. Now, the authors in this particular case refer to examples of a lot of mostly political leaders, from Abraham Lincoln through to George Bush and Ronald Reagan and Nelson Mandela's. And what they found was that throughout time, these leaders have created and shaped identities, and those identities have then created and shaped institutions, organizations, and even societies. So what we're getting at here is that leaders who really want to get things done and want to harness the power of the collective, which is absolutely essential when you're doing transdisciplinary research. And if you're trying to tackle some of these huge global sustainability challenges, you are going to need to harness the power of all these diverse stakeholders in the group, including, academics and non-researchers, non-academics, and so on. And it requires the leaders to really be what they call entrepreneurs of identity. You've really got to be able to co-create the shared social identity that is appropriately inclusive and accessible to all those different stakeholders so that they can go on this journey with you. It's, again, it can be hard work, but it's absolutely essential to getting everybody on board to help make sure that we're all on the journey together. The fourth point then, the final point, is that effective leaders make us matter. So by this, I mean, they take the ideas and the values and the priorities of the group and they really embed them in reality. It's not just doing actions that are sort of quite simple and transient. It's really about creating processes, rituals, structures, and even the shaping of the physical work environments. And again, drawing on many examples, the authors of the textbook note that these kind of leaders then, effectively, they need to be artists, impresarios, and engineers of identity, and specifically of that social identity that is shared with followers. They use their position to create things like structures, processes, rituals, and so on that people identify with. It can be as simple as even logos and physical representations of who we are as a group. But you've really got to create these structures and rituals and so on to help make it matter and for people to sort of identify with that and then to move forward. Now, to help make it a little bit more applied, because I just realized I'm running a little bit out of time, they developed something called an identity leadership inventory. So they bring all these 4 dimensions together, and there's a full list of 15 questions in the full version of the inventory. So I'm just sharing here the 4 key questions which form what they call the short form version. And so these are questions that you can actually ask of your groups about your leaders to get a sense if they really understand how all this stuff works. If it does work, they're going to be better leaders. So it's really in everyone's best interest to know this. So the questions are like, is the leader a good model member of the group? That's the first point. Does the leader really act as a champion for the group, which is the second point of what they do? The third point then is, does this leader create a sense of cohesion within the group? And the fourth is, does the leader create structures that are useful for group members? Now, this identity leadership inventory has been independently verified. And it found, and it was interesting, was comparison with some other different leadership approaches like transformational leadership, authentic leadership, and leader-member exchange. But what this particular study found explained quite here that rather than just being just another leadership construct, when leadership, as assessed by this inventory, reaches to the very heart of the leadership process and does so in ways that other theories do not. So, in other words, this stuff really works. This new science and paradigm of leadership really does work. You will be a more effective leader. However, and something I found fascinating is that the authors of the textbook and the leadership program highlight the difference between being an effective leader and good leadership. And the difference is in what they call identity content. In other words, what sort of vision are you rallying people around? Is it one that sees others or outgroup members in an unfavorable light, or is it one that helps strengthen the connection between different groups? So in the context of transdisciplinary research, if you're looking to change the behavior of certain groups of people, you need to understand, well, how are they being represented in the research project as active participants? Have they been involved in crafting the vision for success for the project? Do they identify with the project in a positive way? And this is one area that I work on. Connected leadership with First Nations Australians is proving fruitful. And I need to point out, I'm not a First Nations Australian myself, so I do not have a claim to speak for them, but I'm actively working with them in a partnership. And where we see some relevance in the area of sustainability, and this is true, I think, of Indigenous peoples around the world, is this idea of a relational ontology where primacy is given to the relationships between things over the actual things themselves. And this is often reflected in the language. And a relational ontology also very much lends itself to complex systems thinking, which is also quite common in sustainability research. Now, interestingly, when I was first learning about social identity theory and the 5R leadership program, I was struck by how compatible it seemed with my understanding of Indigenous ways. So Western science refers to social identity theory. First Nations Australians often refer to them to their mob. It's basically, that's the social identity group that they identify with that defines, a lot of their personal identities is through those social identities with their mob. And therefore, leading in this way, leading through social identity theory, was actually very natural to most First Nations Australians that we've engaged with so far. And inclusivity, accessibility, and respect are very common principles when working with First Nations Australians. So I believe, it's very much a work in progress, but what we're finding is that when it comes to creating a culture of inclusivity, accessibility, and respect, and to nurture the trust and understanding required for deep and meaningful collaboration, and to effectively transform the way we understand ourselves and our connection with nature from being at the top of the hierarchy to actually this more holistic view, there's actually a great deal we can be learning by working with our First Nations communities around the world. So to summarize now, the right slide, sorry, just checking. Basically, leadership is a responsibility. And for those of us in leadership roles, we have a responsibility to be effective leaders. Just as as researchers, we have a responsibility to be effective scientists. And that means building the skills and capabilities required. But which ones? Well, like most things, it starts with awareness. And the identity leadership inventory can be a very good first step in assessing the leadership capabilities of your leaders. So, asking the questions, are they a model member? Do they act as a champion? Do they create a sense of cohesion with the group and the structures that are useful for group members? And you'll find that most leaders can improve in one or many of these areas, in which case they need to find ways to do that. And there's a lot that can be found in the literature. If you know where to look, I'm happy to include some references on that. I highly recommend the textbook that forms the basis of the 5R leadership program, as well as the 5R leadership program itself, which, as per this slide, has been proven to be effective via a randomized control trial. So this isn't just making it up. The results here show that if you do the leadership program, you will develop identity leadership strengths and content in a very positive way compared to control groups. And another tool that's maybe quite useful is something they've introduced called the social identity mapping. And it can be a very powerful tool which shows the different groups that people engage with in their work and the quality of the relationships between those groups. Because this really shows you how the organization is working, how are the groups collaborating with each other and where there are tensions and where people need to focus. So there are actually a lot of insights and tools that can be given. I realize in a very short talk, I can't get into much detail. The references are here. So, and I believe this presentation we made available. So yeah, please at any point, if you've got any questions, reach out. I should have my email address on the, through this, there's my email address there. It'll be available on the slides. Very happy to talk to anyone who wants to know more about this. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Crighton. Very quick question before we go to the next speaker. So I really like your concept where you highlighted that leadership is about getting people to want to do things for us, for the group. So how can connected leadership principles be integrated into educational programs so we can cultivate this desired qualities in a future research and leadership?
Great question. Thank you, Ola. There's actually a whole program of work focused on the educational side of it, but just recently, one of the areas we've been looking at is specifically about leadership development for early and mid-career researchers. And there have been a couple of, other members of the group have been presenting to those early mid-career researchers about this, and the feedback has been fantastic. So the idea is to integrate the program or a variation of the program into the way the research centers are running. And basically, we've found that early mid-career researchers in particular are really engaged by these ideas. They find them fascinating and they really see it as valuable to their career development. There's been less interest by some of the more senior people who think they know it all, which is maybe not as you would that not uncommon, but certainly early mid-career researchers, most research centers and groups have got a program or should have a program of research and development. It absolutely, we're trying to find other ways to incorporate this kind of training and development into these programs so that more early mid-career researchers have access to it, because it's going to be such an important part of their careers as they move, to become more senior research scientists. So yeah, it definitely belongs there, and we're just working out the best way to get it there and to make it more accessible to more people around the world.
Thank you so much. Any other question from our floor? Yeah, very interesting